Thank you so much for the introduction and the opportunity today. First of all, I will also acknowledge that I am coming from North Delta, speaking to you from North Delta, from my home, the traditional territory of the Kwantlen, Katzie, Semiahmoo, and the Tsawwassen First Nations. Um, and also, while I'm thinking of it, I'm going to acknowledge a couple people who are not presenting with me today, but have been working behind the scenes, do a lot of the work that I am going to present to you. So Allison Weston is one of our land and resource specialists. Brianna Teal, who is going to be returning soon as our land and resource specialist, and our regional initiative section head, Monica Pearson, have all been doing a lot of the work that I have the privilege of presenting some of the results of that work today. I also just want to say that having groups like this pull together in this way and having conversations to get focused and to reflect a variety of perspectives is of extraordinary value to me and to our ministry and to the work of the province. Um, we recognize that not everyone who has interests is represented here, but I do think this group has started something that is going to help us really start bringing people together around some common values and objectives as we work forward. And it's just been a pleasure working with this group. Just all of the organizers. Jason invited me, a few weeks ago to start getting engaged in this, and at first I was a little nervous about just exactly what the scale and scope and nature and value of this work is. But the more I've worked with this group, the more excited I've been about where they're headed and where we're headed. All right, so maybe just a quick introduction, and this is, well, a bit of a messy slide, but I want to just clarify um, just what our function is within the Ministry of FLNRORD, which is a large organization with lots of different parts. And we are anticipating some adjustments to our ministry over the coming weeks, but I think these functions will continue to exist in one form or another. So there's kind of four key legislative tools that right down the center there. And we have different parts of the organization that really kind of are sent around managing each of those pieces of legislation. And of course, that's towards those functions on the left, towards good forest management, crown land management, stream and water management, and then fish and wildlife populations. And of course, all of that we're doing towards engagement and reconciliation with First Nations. The role of our team specifically is kind of outlined on the right. So, on the bottom, we're the decision maker under the Wildlife Act. So, that's kind of where we're anchored as a team with my team. And then we really are asked to provide support on all those other pieces of legislation. And there are other pieces of legislation, but these are kind of the big ones, I would say, within the ministry. So I'm going to go through some of these in a little more detail. So the Wildlife Act, it's generally designed for managing wildlife, both populations and individuals. But there are some habitat provisions. There's Section 34, which many of you will be familiar with, which manages birds' nests particularly. And then the one that I think this group has been most interested in has been wildlife management areas under Section 4.2. So this is a designation for areas considered to be of significant benefit to fish and wildlife, and it's designated by the minister with cabinet approval. So it's a fairly high level decision, and it does allow. It's not like a park. It does allow for other compatible land uses. Um, and then we within the region can actually prohibit certain activities by order. We have a number of these WMAs around the region, and many of them we're managing through a partnership through what we call SCLAMP, or the South Coast Conservation Lands Management Program, where we have a partnership with the federal government and some NGOs. And Eric Balke, who I believe may be on this call, is our coordinator of that very important work. One thing I would say about WMAs is that it's a heavy tool for us to lift. Let's just say that. The last WMA that we had established in the South Coast was the Klahat Chehalis WMA in the Harrison Chehalis estuary. And that process took us about 20 years to get that WMA established. I'm not suggesting that every WMA will take 20 years to get established, but it is a it is a considerably arduous process, let's just say. And again, not something that we're afraid of, or not, and it's certainly a tool that's in the toolbox and may be appropriate for certain areas, but not something that we can pick up and move quickly. And then there's the Water Sustainability Act. So this act was updated from the old Water Act in 2016. It primarily manages both fresh water and streams. Many of you would be familiar with Section 11, which manages changes to streams. So doing work in or about a stream that causes change to a stream can only occur with an authorization. Um, and there's lots of interpretation about what actually constitutes changes to a stream. Uh, I have a friend who recently parked the wheels of his 4x4 on the banks of Upper Stave Lake, and he got a $350 ticket for illegal changes in or about a stream. Anyway, so it gives you a sense of just the breadth of what could be considered changes in or about a stream. Section 46 includes prohibition on introducing foreign matter into a stream. And then the big change that has come through the WSA, or one of the big changes, is this Division 4, which is sections 64 to 85. And it's the establishment of what are called water sustainability plans. It's a longer term process, and we have not completed a water sustainability plan as yet. There is at least one in our region that is currently the process has commenced in Langley. Um, it has planning provisions intended to support preventing or addressing a number of different things like conflicts between users. Um, and I think what's of maybe of most interest to this group is it does include risks to aquatic ecosystem health. And then it also can identify restoration measures, and it can curtail or impact water rights, um, including options for compensation under the WSA. The focus so far has been around water use, but it can go beyond that and can actually restrict and prohibit the use of land across different statutes, which is really the incredibly powerful part of the plan process. It is again another fairly heavy tool, both in terms of the timelines for delivery, but also the level of endorsement. So it essentially gets elevated to the ministerial level. Then we have the Land Act. And so this is the act that governs us as the landlord, if you will, um, and the leaseholders, the renters, the users of Crown land. Um, and the statutory decision maker can and does consider what is the highest and best use in the adjudication. And so it's fairly open ended in terms of what is considered in an adjudication under the Land Act. Um, and it's yeah, so it's quite a broad tool in that respect. There's nothing explicit in terms of habitat provisions, but there's really some helpful elements involved, which I'll talk about. So there's different types of reserves under Section 10.1. We can essentially designate an area, or the minister can order a certain area where no applications for any activities can be made over a geographic area. Then there's Section 15 reserves, and this is it's very similar to 10.1, but it's basically removing land from disposition for any purpose in the interest of the public, and this is done through an order in council at the cabinet level. And then there's Section 16s, and this is again withdrawing an area from disposition, so an area that cannot be um, uh, basically tenured. Um, and it's generally speaking considered to be a temporary level of withdrawal. However, we do find that Section 16s can persist for many, many years. And and some of them, if they're persisting for a long period of time, there may need to be a consideration of converting them to a Section 15. And the interesting thing about Section 16s and 17s is that those are actually delegated down to the regional authority. And recent Section 16s and 17s in our region have been approved by our regional executive director, essentially my boss. And then Section 17 is to designate a portion of land for a particular use uh, or for the conservation of natural or heritage resources. And we have a fairly large Section 17 that overlaps with the heart of the Fraser, which I'll show you in a moment. And then we also have what's called the permissions policy, which really identifies which activities are essentially permitted and that may be undertaken that don't have a negative impact on the environment, including things like the removal of garbage and materials brought onto the land. Um, and so these are activities that could be essentially considered to be not permitted, if they are impacting on the enjoyment of other crown land users or it is causing negative impacts to the environment and wildlife. So um, essentially, there are ticketing provisions under that policy, under the act. That's the wrong button. So I'm going to talk about the tool that you're looking at here in a moment, but this is just demonstrating the existing reserves that we have on the Fraser River, and these reserves are established for these are 15, 16, and 17 reserves, um, and they've been established for various purposes. You'll notice the 15s are out on the banks and in Boundary Bay, and then we have a number of different reserves. The one I just wanted to highlight, wrong button again, is the Section 17 reserve, which essentially is a restriction on any removal of sediment or gravel from the river in this area. It was established in 2015 as a temporary reserve, but has been renewed each time it has come up for renewal. And we don't anticipate that shifting anytime soon. Essentially, this reserve was established by recommendation of our water manager, um, who felt that we were unable to assess the cumulative impacts of the removal of gravel. And so we needed to essentially notify potential applicants that we were not going to consider any applications for gravel removal until we could address this cumulative effects question more thoroughly. All right. So the next tool or the next piece of legislation is FERPA, Forest and Range Practices Act. This is generally designed for the management of forest values. The provisions for management of activities on Crown land is incorporated in the tool. And so there is an opportunity for something called a Section 58 order, which is named as the protection of recreation and range resources on Crown land. So again, the authority here is pretty local. So it's either our regional executive director or our rec sites and trails manager, and it may restrict or prohibit a particular non-recreational use of of a resource management zone, a landscape unit, or a sensitive area. Anyway, and this order is actually being considered in a few different areas within our region where we do have some activities that we consider to be um, inappropriate, let's say, given the nature and the sensitivity of the site. I would say in general, there's an acknowledgement that our rec sites and trails group is better set up for managing sort of forest related recreational activities. Um, the urban rural issues that we often run into here in the South Coast are quite challenging for that group and maybe better managed through local governments. So where do we start? In terms of wielding these tools within the heart of the Fraser. And these are some of my thoughts as we've been meeting together. And I know we've talked about this several times and certainly been reflected in the focus of this morning's sessions, but we do need to start with the First Nations. And this is not only because we know it's the right thing to do, but it is certainly the law under DRIPA. This is BC's pathway to reconciliation. We are looking for increased transparency and increased predictability in our relationships and workings with First Nations. So I think that this group has done an excellent job of setting us up for those conversations, and the work that we have been doing is setting us up. But I do think that's the next logical place, is to start thinking about how and just what the First Nations perspectives are. And I know the LFFA is playing a critical role in leading to that. The other thing I would say is I do think that, my observation is that this is actually a great place to for us to be able to start conversations with First Nations, is to start with our stewardship and start with their stewardship of the heart of the Fraser. I think the next thing, and this is very much in line with what Bruce has been talking about, we need to start thinking about what our values are. And I'm speaking more precisely, I guess. Um, what exactly are the things that we are going to uh, that we care about in the heart of the Fraser? We need to start sort of laying that out for ourselves, so we can have a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve, and yeah, and really prioritize those things. And then we need to start clarifying our objectives, describe what we want, and be as precise as we can. And I would add to that, we need to put it on a map. We need to spell that out geographically. And then, of course, we start managing towards them. Those are operational decisions, but also looking at things like conservation designations where appropriate. And then the last thing is we assess. We continue to assess the current, past, and future conditions, and take advantage of the good work that's being done by academics like Mike and Ryan and others. Um, yeah, there's more I could say about that, but I'm going to keep going. So, what have we been doing so far within the ministry? I would say that we've started by trying to get our own house in order. So we've started to identify, when we think about the Fraser River, and we haven't been thinking specifically about the heart of the Fraser. We've been thinking about the Fraser River within the South Coast region in general. So what are the values that are front and center? What are the things that government has told us that we're responsible for, and the things that we're actually managing for one way or another? Well, obviously, white sturgeon is near the top of that list. We're managing in-channel habitat through our decisions on sediment removals. We're managing bank conditions through, reviewing proposals to armor the river. Um, we manage riparian conditions, either directly or indirectly, with local governments. Marsh ecosystems, huge issue for us, particularly with the WMAs that we have out on the banks of the river. Um, and we have a responsibility to assess and to manage those, and over time to restore them. And of course, species at risk. If we look at what are we doing in terms of setting objectives, well, we've started by pulling together what we already have, what we've been using. So let's look at the reserves that have been put in place over time. Let's look at what our population targets are, and use those as sort of the foundation for looking at what our habitat objectives will be, and so on. And then I think we're just now getting to the point where we can start pulling this information and seeking opportunity to speak with First Nation communities about what their objectives are, in the context of these values and others. Of action, so we have been implementing the wildlife regulations. So we are making decisions on populations and habitat, on angling restrictions, and so on. We make decisions under the WSA, and I put in brackets their refusals. Um, we we don't tend to the refusals to do certain works in the river don't tend to hit the newspapers, but we do make a number of decisions to refuse certain actions and activities. Same things under the Land Act, and then being engaged in supporting habitat restoration efforts, like some of the work that Ian presented this morning, and then assessment work. So again, the focus of late has been pulling together the existing data, looking at just how much of the river have we hardened, where are our marsh ecosystems, what's the condition of them, what's the condition of our riparian areas and the adjacent land uses, species at risk habitat distribution, and then now starting to pull together again the work that Ryan's done and trying to work with the port and pulling together what's going on with sediment in the river. So what does this actually look like? Well, we've been very much focused on developing what we call the SBOT, or a stewardship baseline objectives tool. This idea of mapping out our objectives really came from our work in the forest sector. Several years ago, my boss came to me and asked me, as we were proposing new wildlife habitat areas for different species at risk or ungulate winter range polygons that were impacting on the timber harvest land base. And she asked me, Scott, when are you guys done? When are you going to be finished with this work? And I said, what do you mean? I said, well, this kind of ongoing business. She says, well, I want to know, like, what are you aiming at? Like, when will we have all of our WHA and ungulate winter range work done, so we know that it's done and we don't need to approve those anymore? And I realized, oh, we have a problem. In terms of understanding how these ecosystems work, that we need to manage all of this. We aren't just looking for little polygons, little protected areas on the land base. We need to manage the whole system. But I also acknowledge we needed to find a way for us to communicate that clearly to decision makers so they can understand the context and be responsible across scale. So this started as a really an answer to that question, and we've started to integrate it into various areas of our business for different species and values. So we're looking at things like on the river, we've started to map out where is the hardening of the river at different scales. And you'll notice what's missing from the dials down here on the bottom. It says where we are. It doesn't tell us where we want to be. And I think that's the next step, is to start figuring out what are our targets? What are we trying to achieve in terms of shoreline hardening, for example. Same thing for adjacent land uses. For dredging, and we don't have all of the data we want quite yet in terms of sediment in the river, but we're getting there, and we're starting to think about what are our targets for sediment removal, particularly in the sand reach. And then what about the habitat? Where are the core habitats? And again, what are our objectives for those habitats moving forward, whether it's protected or not? So again, we're trying to pull together, as we start thinking about our objectives, pull together all of the existing work that's being done in the river and really start to map it out and pull it together into one sort of central system that will communicate, small scale reports that will inform statutory decisions, but also inform those bigger sort of planning objectives that I think this group's all about. So maybe pause there and see if you guys have any questions. I do have a lot more slides on the tool, but gives you enough to see what we're working on, hopefully.
All right, Scott, thank you for that. We do have a few minutes left in the time we had for your talk. So there's a few questions in the Slido. I was just having a look at it as you finished, and I put the first one up, and we'll see if you can tackle this one. You said step one is to start with First Nations. So what does this look like? Is there a system in place for this already? How do you see this unfolding in the heart of the Fraser?
I think that I don't have the answer to that right now. I think that that's a conversation that we need to have with people like Murray, and obviously some of the, well, essentially all of those nations. And I think, there is obviously a challenge with just the number of nations, and there are lots of different perspectives and points of view that we need to understand and bring together. And I think that's I'm not going to offer an answer to that question other than to say I think we need to find a way to answer that question.
All right, well, if you don't mind, I'll throw another one up, and I'll invite you to start with this one, but if there's something in here for Bruce Runciman, we could always bring Bruce in on this one as well, or we could bring Bruce in on it in the open discussion. But I'll start with you because I think it applies to a provincial designation at first. It's how does the ALR designation constrain existing fish and fish habitat protection regulations? So I will say this question came in on the back end of Bruce's talk, but I thought I'd put it up because it starts with a provincial designation, and then see if Bruce wanted to add to that.
So I guess well, it kind of depends on what we want to do, obviously. And we do have, for instance, WMAs that overlap ALR land, and we've been able to get through that issue in the past. And so it isn't a barrier for some of the tools that we have to implement, for sure. I guess the other comment I just want to make, though, is that, and I know Bruce was making this point too, is that as we start to really clarify and map out and communicate these objectives, I really do think they can transcend sort of regulatory boundaries and barriers, right? Because ultimately we need to find a way to get everybody pulling in the same direction. I think that most of the people involved in this workshop probably have very common goals in terms of what we'd like to see in the heart of the Fraser, and it's really about pulling everybody else along with us, right? And I think that would be my central point, is if we can be really clear about what we're trying to achieve, then I think then we can present that to a number of different organizations and consider it across a number of contexts, and then sort out what those barriers are or are not. But I don't think that should stop us from setting those objectives.
Right, well, thanks for that, Scott. I'll maybe just bring Bruce in, since I kind of teed you up there, Bruce, to see if you wanted to comment further on that, just building on what Scott shared in the last couple of minutes we have here. Oh, I can't hear you again, Bruce. You might have to do that.
How about now?
There we go. Thanks.
Okay. It's pretty tough to follow Scott on any day, but his answer to this one was particularly good. I will only echo to say that having an ALR designation does not predicate the decision that the department's going to come to when we're looking at a project or needing to make a decision on a project. But it is something that we would need to consider in light of what is the purpose to which that land is dedicated and what is the history of use and the condition of habitat on that land in relation to this project. And I think Scott really closed the loop on that well when he said objectives can transcend boundaries. And at some point, if we want to change the outcome for fish and habitat in the heart of the Fraser, it needs to become a discussion less so about what will DFO accept on a project by project basis than where does my work, regardless of whether it goes to DFO or BC or anyone else or the Indigenous councils, where does it fit in what this vision that's been framed for the desirable end states in the heart of the Fraser? I think if we start defining from the mountaintops down to the stream channels what our objectives are so that we can line up those decisions behind them, then we're going to start to see more favorable outcomes. But it'll be a tough go if it's about establishing points of flexibility between opposing authorities or advocacy groups. Really, I think we should seek to transcend those boundaries.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Bruce. I think between you and Scott, you guys covered that one nicely.